connecting the dots is not only about energy, it's about energy, water, food, climate, and something else I don't remember. You'll see in a moment. But each particular year we concentrate on one focal direction. And as it happened, 2013, in spring quarter this year, we focused on energy as it relates to water, climate, and all those other things I told you, food. So what we thought we would do, what we were invited to do for you this week in the Slack Energy Week, was to give you Connecting the Dots version 0.5. So this is an abbreviated overview of what Connecting the Dots is like. There will be another Connecting the Dots in fall quarter this year, and then you can have the full strength version. I'm not sure what the focal direction will be this year, but you will have the opportunity to find out. So the format of this session, we're going to run for about 1 hour here, and I am going to ask the panel members to tell us a little about the directions of what they spoke about in spring or any further thoughts they've had since then. And then that'll take about 5 minutes for each of them, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from all of you. So I'd like to begin with Stacy. You've heard about her. She is a professor in the Chemical Engineering Department, but she's also, importantly, the director of the Tomcat Center for Sustainability. And she was in charge of the Connecting the Dots in general. So I'd like to ask you, Stacy, please tell us a bit about Connecting the Dots and or Tomcat, if you like.
Okay, is this on?
You got 5 minutes. Let me remind you of that.
Already using up my time. Okay, great. Just a quick introduction about this Connecting the Dots idea, and then I'll tell you a little bit about who's involved in it. So you've been hearing some already about some of the big challenges. You're focused on energy, but there are a lot of challenges facing us globally this century, not just energy, but also being able to get clean water for people and ecosystems, enough food for everybody, and a sustainable and protected environment. And what you'll find as you learn more about what's going on here at Stanford is there is a lot of very good and important research going on in each of those topics, and also health and security and some of these other big challenges. What's also happening is that these are all interrelated. So you can't be talking about food without understanding how energy is involved in that. It takes energy to make food, and food, as many of you know, is being used for energy, for example. And a lot of very important work's being carried out at Stanford also in these interconnections, and that was really the origin of the Connecting the Dots, was to look at these interconnections between food, energy, water, climate, security, and health. So about 3 years ago, we've now had our third Connecting the Dots event. They're held in the spring, either on Earth Day or around Earth Day, to look at these different topics. The first year, we focused on food at the center and the interconnections with all the other dots. Second year was focused on water, and this last spring was focused on energy at the center. And I invite you to go to the Tomcat Center website. You can link to the Connecting the Dots, and you can watch the videos, and you can actually see any of these previous events. But this was not sponsored just by the Tomcat Center for Sustainable Energy. So just to give you an idea of how involved a number of different organizations are here at Stanford in this, it was co-sponsored by the Precourt Institute for Energy, the School of Earth Sciences, the Woods Institute for the Environment, the Center on Food Security and the Environment, an NSF Center on the nation's urban water infrastructure called Renew It, and also the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. And these organizations, and actually others here at Stanford, are very interested in these topics and also the interconnections between them.
I'll see if I can pull anybody off their chair with this one. Thank you, Stacy. Just hold on to your questions for a little while. We'll go to questions when we've been through the rank here. So I'd like to introduce you next to Adam Brandt. As you've heard, he's a professor of Energy Resources Engineering, same department as mine. So we'll start with him because of the fact that the energy was the focus of this particular year's Connecting the Dots. And during the spring quarter meeting itself, which was actually a few hours long, we talked a lot, not unsurprisingly, about shale gas. So let's see what Adam has to say about shale gas.
Sure. Thanks, Roland. So both by virtue of the fact that natural gas was covered a lot during the Connecting the Dots meeting, and by virtue of the fact that I've been doing some work on it, I thought I'd talk to you guys a little bit more about the connections between natural gas and these other things we care about: climate, water, jobs, and economic security. So one thing to note is that there's been a really incredible expansion of natural gas production and concurrent drop in natural gas prices over the last 5 years due to the combination of commercialization of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. This has presents a lot of opportunities in terms of the areas that Connecting the Dots is talking about, and also presents a lot of challenges. And I'll just talk about opportunities first, and then I'll talk about challenges. In terms of opportunities, big opportunities in terms of climate. So over the last 5 years or so, there's been the largest percentage drop in the fraction of U.S. power generation that's generated by coal. Since at least the mid-1960s, the fraction of U.S. power generated by coal dropped by over 10%, something like 11 or 12% over 5 years, which is unprecedented in many decades. This is largely due to the fact that we've got a lot of cheap gas right now. So this is obviously a major climate benefit, in addition to other air quality benefits, mostly because natural gas has combustion emissions less than half of coal per unit of electricity produced. Another opportunity on the climate front in terms of natural gas is that natural gas, by virtue of the way it interacts with the power grid, is actually a really nice technology to support renewables. It's a very flexible generation technology, has the right mix of capital and operating costs in order to lend itself well to intermittent, basically support of intermittent power sources. So in that sense, natural gas can be a big climate opportunity. On the social side of things, or sort of the jobs, kind of food, social security kind of part of the Connecting the Dots nexus, natural gas has a lot of opportunities. Cheap natural gas brings a lot of opportunities to U.S. industry. A lot of companies are bringing primary manufacturing back to the U.S. or considering doing so because of cheap energy. This can bring jobs to people who've been left behind by recent economic developments, which is a good thing. It could also reduce, for example, our trade deficit if we substitute oil for gas, or gas for oil in heavy trucking, say, which is something that people are talking about. In terms of challenges, I'll just list a few, and these are in the same sort of areas. In terms of climate, natural gas looks really good on a combustion basis, but if you have high leakage rates from gas systems because of the high global warming potential of methane, this can reduce a lot of the benefits associated with, say, stopping burning coal and starting burning more gas. I've done a lot of work on gas leakage over the last year. I'd be happy to talk to you guys about it. I'm sure I'll be giving talks about it on campus, so if you want to hear more about natural gas leakage, I could talk to you about that. The other main climate sort of challenge is that gas isn't emissions free, right? It maybe has 45% of the emissions of coal, but this is not zero, and so in the long term we need to come up with a strategy to decarbonize gas and eliminate those carbon emissions. In terms of water, there are potential impacts. There are reputable studies that are now starting to show higher hydrocarbon concentrations in drinking water wells that are near wells that have been hydraulically fractured. This is almost certainly a function of well casing and not necessarily the fracking process itself. I can talk to you more about that, but that's obviously pollution of fresh water is a big concern. And in terms of social or sort of jobs impacts, one thing that's been happening is that cheap natural gas hasn't just been pushing out coal, which it's mostly been doing, but it's also been putting pressure on renewable energy generators because it's so cheap that it's undercutting a lot of the economic motivation to invest in renewables. And so one thing that I think needs to happen on sort of the policy and economics front is that we need to integrate natural gas in with renewables in a way that they aren't so competitive, but they're more complementary, where we can still invest in renewables and really have natural gas investment there to firm these things up. And that's sort of kind of a short summary of what's going on in natural gas. And again, feel free to ask any questions.
All right, thank you, Adam. I see the swagger's this way. I anoint you, Stacy Bent. All right, so moving on then, the next panel member is Stefan Reichelstein. He is a professor of accounting in the School of Business and to most of us, accounting means money, but he in fact accounts for other things too. And in particular, he has research and activity in the general area of the cost of reducing carbon emissions. He teaches some courses on sustainability and clean energy. So, Stefan, can you tell us a bit about what's going on in the economics of low carbon energy, please?
Happy to do so. Unfortunately, I only have two hands. So.
Okay. Adam can lend you the mic there.
Yeah, so in the economics of low carbon energy, I think there are a couple of promising developments, and I want to follow up on some of the things that Adam just mentioned and sketched. My main statement that I want you to sort of walk away here from is, while there are some promising developments, if the US is to really make the transition to a low carbon economy, the most important thing in my mind is public policy will have to be a lot more forceful, a lot more active, and ultimately also a lot more predictable. Otherwise, I don't really see it happening just in terms of the fundamental economics of the different energy sources. Let me talk for a moment about renewables. We are seeing the cost of renewable energy coming down very rapidly, in particular in the area of solar PV. That cost gap is being closed really at a remarkable pace, and there are a number of factors playing into that equation. In fact, if you look at certain segments here, say a company that is thinking of installing solar panels on their rooftops now, so commercial scale solar installations, you could argue we are already there in the current environment. Now, when I say this, immediately as a qualifier, two big things. You need a favorable location. We have a favorable location here in the southwestern United States that satisfies that. But more importantly, the public subsidies, in particular the federal subsidies that are in place for solar PV, are absolutely crucial. And those are, at least at the moment, scheduled to expire in a couple of years. The big thing about solar is we have really seen here another confirmation of a dramatic learning curve, cost reduction curve over the last 25 years. And the key observation is this learning and the reductions in cost are driven by production volume. But production volume requires demand, and demand at the moment hinges very much on those public subsidies that are scheduled to go to expire in a number of years. So the key thing is ultimately they can expire, I believe, but not too soon. Otherwise, that very positive development that we have in terms of renewables becoming cheaper is in some jeopardy. If I play this over to fossil fuels for a moment, I think, and again, this picks up on what Adam said a moment ago, the US is now on track to achieve the goal that the administration has set of achieving carbon reductions for the US economy by 17% by the year 2020. This is relative to 2005 levels. And I think we owe this in large part to traditional coal-fired power plants, in particular pulverized coal, being phased out and replaced probably largely by natural gas plants. But the second part of the pledges by the administration was that by 2050, the US would achieve an 86% reduction of its carbon emissions, again, relative to the 2005 standard. Now, that's obviously a lot tougher. And even if you assume renewables perform miraculously well, sort of according to the most optimistic projections, I don't see it happening without a decarbonization of fossil fuels. Now, then you ask, well, how is that possibly going to happen? And again, I would point to a combination of technological developments and cost reductions. And most importantly, public policy sort of flanking these measures. So the EPA could, for instance, take the perspective that it has taken with pulverized coal and simply mandate from a certain point on new natural gas plants have to satisfy an even higher cleanliness standard than natural gas does at this point. That would be a pretty blunt instrument. That would move the needle on emissions, but it would also bring with it a tangible increase in generation prices for electricity, perhaps not as high as some people have us sort of worry about. But then there are other instruments. There's, for instance, the possibility of mixing up basically carrots and sticks in this equation. So you could have a combination of, say, a carbon tax, about which you talked here about in the previous session, say in the range of $30, and at the same time have the same type of public policy federal incentives at the investment level that is currently extended to solar, extend that also to clean fossil fuels. Then the impact in terms of electricity prices would be a lot lower, and you would have the same effect in terms of incentivizing new construction of these natural gas plants to invest in abatement technology. Finally, when we do these numbers, and you can do them in all sorts of permutations here, we're doing this basically on the basis of what we know right now in terms of the construction and operating cost of power plants. There are some really promising projects here in the clean coal and clean fossil fuels domain on the horizon. And they may be game changers in terms of what's doable in this space. But again, you need in the first place incentives for these types of projects to really take hold and for certain learning to occur. So in short, you can cut this in many different ways. What is sort of the cheapest possibility of getting on this transition to a low carbon economy? Some people make us believe that doing so would wreck the economy. Aside from the fact that not doing anything, in my belief, would impose a truly huge cost on the economy, perhaps not now, but over the coming decades. Even if you sort of slice this conservatively and go with what we know today, and you take the set of measures that I've sort of just sketched, I don't see a wrecking ball in those numbers. So no reason to be scared here at the end of the day. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Stefan. So as a good illustration of how connecting the dots brings together people and ideas from across campus, I'm next going to introduce Professor Mike Wara from the School of Law. And I actually don't know this, but I'm willing to speculate that he's the only geochemist on the faculty of the School of Law. And his particular side of connecting the dots was climate. So, Mike, can you give us a rundown on that, please?
Actually, the two previous speakers have given a great introduction for what I'm going to speak about today, and that's given the innovations that we've seen in natural gas recovery and extraction over the last few years and the consequent transformation both in our available fossil fuel reserves in the United States and also in the electricity sector in the United States, the market response in the electricity sector. One thing that I've been thinking a lot about and working with students both within the law school and also actually in the management science and engineering program is trying to understand what the implications of that are internationally. You know, what if we do reduce our emissions via either blunt EPA regulation, and I'm pretty sure that the EPA regs had came out, or the President Obama's climate speech was maybe the same day as connecting the dots or the day before. So that was all sort of happening right now. I think interesting. It's going to be interesting to see what happens this month. The new rule, the blunt instrument, the new Clean Air Act rule for new power plants is due out this month. And so we should see where EPA is going as far as domestic regulation. But if EPA imposes these rather draconian regulations, which would basically mean an end to new coal-fired power plants in the U.S., and hopefully, in my view, some incentives for states to start reducing emissions from existing coal-fired power plants in the not-too-distant future, then what happens? What happens to all those fossil fuels that we have, right? We are the Saudi Arabia of coal. And we're becoming, or maybe we have become, the Saudi Arabia of gas. And if you take away the domestic demand for those resources, one thing that happens is prices fall. Fall relative to what? To prices in the rest of the world. And that implies a real push for exports of these fuels. And one of the issues that I highlighted in my talk, and I think is still a really interesting and developing issue, is what are we going to do about those exports? How should we think about our climate responsibility, for example, if we shift from mining lots of coal in the Powder River Basin to burn in power plants in the Ohio River Valley, to mining lots of coal in the Powder River Basin to export to South Korea or to southern China to burn in power plants there. Should we account for that carbon? Should we account for it in our decision-making processes where we're obligated to consider the environmental impacts of major decisions in the United States because of a law called the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA? I'll tell you that the companies that mine the coal, that want to sell it, are busy building export terminals to ship that coal somewhere else because they see the writing on the wall. They see the writing on the wall that says the U.S. domestic market is going away for them, but there is an enormous developing country market for their product, mined coal. Now, of course, you all know, hopefully or probably at this point, that no matter where you burn that coal, you're going to have the same climate impact. You may have you may shift your air pollution impacts, the kind of impacts that make people sick and give kids asthma, to some other location. But to a significant degree, the climate impact is the same. Should we be concerned about that? Should we consider those decisions? Interestingly, for the big decisions that are being made right now, the states that have to make the permitting decisions and the federal government, in particular the Army Corps of Engineers, disagree about whether we need to consider the broader global implications of what we are, or what the companies that would like to build the terminals are thinking about doing. So one thing to be thinking about as we move forward with domestic climate policy is, what are the international implications? Should we just export our fuel? Should we become a Norway, for example? Norway is a country with very low domestic emissions of greenhouse gases. But the entire economy is supported now and for the foreseeable future via its sovereign wealth fund by exports of fossil fuels to other countries where they are burned and create climate impacts. Should we go in that direction, or should we set a different kind of example on the international stage for how an exporter of fossil fuels is going to behave? Because for better or worse, we are becoming very rapidly a major exporter of coal, one of the largest if these terminals get built in the world, and in a relatively rapid time frame as well, a major exporter of natural gas. And so we need to start thinking as a country, both from a climate perspective, from a science and geochemistry perspective, how we should account for those emissions, and probably from a legal one as well, whether we should in some way take account of the impacts that those exports will cause when they are eventually used. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Mike. So moving now to our final address before we move to question and answer, I'll introduce Professor David Lobel. He's a professor in the Department of Environmental Earth System Science, which is known on campus as EESS. And his particular specialty is crop yields and the relationship between crops and climate. So, David, can you tell us a bit of the relationship between food, climate, and energy?
Sure. So let me back up a little bit and just say that this Connecting the Dots series that we've been running, and I've been involved in each of them, has a component which wasn't mentioned, which is to really emphasize student involvement. So we have a bunch of tutorials for the last hour which are run by students in topics of their choice, and they basically apply to participate. So there'll be 4 or 5 sessions, and depending on whatever the topic is this year, that may interest some of you later on in the year. So it's something to keep in mind. Yeah, so given the temperature in this room and the time of the day, I'm not going to try to inundate you too much. So I work in the Department of Environmental System Science, as Roland said, and also in the Center on Food Security. And we think a lot about the interactions between food and energy. I'll be giving a talk later this week, for those of you still surviving, on biofuels on Wednesday. So let me just give you maybe 3 quick points to remember, three numbers that that are easy enough to remember, and maybe you can remember what they mean. So the first is 2. The second is 20, and the third is 40. The 2 relates to the role of energy in food production. So you'll hear lots of statements about how dependent our modern agricultural system is on energy. And to some extent that's true, but it's also true that we've become remarkably efficient at using energy in agriculture, and it does wonders for agriculture. We use a lot less labor and land than we used to. But if you look at all of the energy that goes into fertilizer productions or goes into driving tractors and all these different uses of energy, it all amounts up to about 2% of the energy that we use in the world is going into food production. So there are still opportunities to improve there, but it is not nearly as high as most people would think, and it's partly because we become so much more efficient. In the U.S., for example, we use less energy in agriculture now than we did 50 years ago, even though we produce almost 3 times or more, depending on how you measure it. So the 20 is about the overall food system. So we know that something we think about in the center and on campus is how these systems go end to end, not just in the production phase, but how it reaches the consumer. And the 20 is the total amount of energy globally that's used in some aspect of the food system. So the difference, the 18% difference, is basically associated somewhat with transport, but mostly with the processing steps and the cooking and the retail and all of that. So in the big picture, those are the opportunities for reducing energy use associated with food consumption. Now the 40 is what I think most of what I'll talk about Wednesday is on, and a lot of the discussion at the Connecting the Dots was on kind of looking at the other side of the equation, which is not how is energy important for agriculture, but how is agriculture now important for energy. And 40 is currently the percent of corn in this country that goes into producing ethanol. And this is a number that's risen from well below 5% a decade ago to be 40% today. And there's various reasons for that. One of them is actually well, there's policy reasons for that. There's economic reasons for that. One of them being the shale gas revolution that has actually made it more profitable to turn corn into ethanol. So, for example, at today's prices of corn and today's prices of natural gas, it's actually cheaper to produce the energy in the form of ethanol, or it's about the same, depending on the price of oil, as it is to produce gasoline. And so even without all of the subsidies and policies in place right now, that there is a very strong demand for using corn and other crops into the energy system. What we see, though, is that because the energy system is so immense compared to the energy content of food, basically, that what that causes is very significant impacts on the food side of things. You see very tight correlations now between food prices and energy prices. And so that introduces all sorts of questions, all sorts of challenges. And it's, I think, emblematic of a lot of these connections that we look at, where you realize that some of the challenges you thought were hard are doubly or triply hard, but at the same time you see some of the opportunities that you see are doubly or triply more exciting. So for example, for me, understanding the full cost of the liquid fuel use of corn ethanol makes any innovations in sort of non-liquid transportation that much more exciting, because it creates that much more slack for feeding the world in the future. So, obviously we can open up to questions, and I can talk more on Wednesday. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, David, and thank you to all of our speakers. Now, as David just mentioned rather well, the Connecting the Dots had some speeches of the character, the ones that you just heard, all a little longer, but it also involved students in a very significant way. So there were more than 300 people involved in Connecting the Dots, and a lot of interaction took place among the audience, between the audience themselves and the audience and the speakers. So I'd like to invite any of you to ask questions now. Feel free to ask them of a specific speaker if you wish to, or you can just ask them in general, and I'll put somebody on the spot for you. Please.
Sarah Rice from the Business School. I was wondering, we have the California cap and trade, and we also may have EPA regulations coming out. What do you see as the sectors and technologies that could be opportunities emerging from these new regulations and policies, and what's left out?
Stefan, sounds like you or Mike or both.
Well, there are, the specifics of the California cap and trade, as I understand it, is still evolving, and policy is being set sort of almost as we speak in terms of what the obligated parties are, and the number of allowances given to different sectors. I mean, you mentioned in your question that opportunities. So the one thing that I'm encouraged by is I mentioned in passing at the end the clean energy and clean coal projects that are on the horizon now, one of them being the Texas Clean Energy Project, which is really a traditional clean coal project, and that's sort of a longer story in terms of what that particular plant is going to be about. But the one thing that seems to be happening is that all of these players are now sort of having their, while the original, the TCEP, the Texas Clean Energy Project, is a Texas project, as the name suggests, they're now having increasingly their eyes on California. Because that really, the cap and trade system and the effective carbon tax that is being anticipated by the parties really gives those types of projects exactly the kind of economic boost that we're looking for. That is, it really may put them over the hump in terms of being profitable from an investor perspective. And so in that sense, I do see a connection between the carbon tax that we're seeing here and new investment opportunities, or incentivizing new investments.
I would say, I'd agree with everything that Stefan said. I think the challenge in the electricity sector is the cost of these new first-of-kind technology investments is very high. They tend to be kind of bet-the-company investments. And without policy certainty, it's very difficult to make those investments. You know, I'd point to, if you want to look at how this is unfolding in real time, go look at the Vogtle reactors that are being constructed right now by Georgia Power. They're the first two of four new nuclear units that are under construction really since 3 Mile Island. And they are way over budget. And they're so far over budget that the commission, that the Public Service Commission of Georgia, that has to think about these problems, decide whether to bill ratepayers for these billions of dollars in cost overruns, is thinking about whether to A, finish the plant, or B, stop construction and build gas plants on the site, build combined cycle gas turbines on the site, because that actually might be cheaper than finishing these nuclear units. So without policy certainty at the federal level, or at least at the state level in a larger set of states than just California, and to the degree that there is policy certainty in California, and Stefan's point on that is exactly right, it's tough to know what to pick. The one place where I would point to as a potential locus of innovation and opportunity is the vehicle fleet. You know, I think, you know, this, if there's one thing that's happened this summer, you know, in the stock market, you know, it's Tesla, right? And the fact that Tesla has been able to deliver a product in some volume that people actually want to buy that doesn't involve liquid fuels. And 40% of U.S. emissions come from the vehicle fleet. And so and we're not going to do carbon capture at the car level. So ultimately, there's going to be a combination. If we're going to address greenhouse gas emissions, there's going to have to be a combination of real transformation of the vehicle fleet combined with stable support for clean, renewable energy in the electricity sector, or some mix of technologies in the electricity sector. The fact that there's even just one company that's come to market with a product that people want to buy, I think is a really exciting development and an interesting opportunity, even apart from any regulatory support. Although it's worth noting that Tesla's making money right now because they're selling zero-emission vehicle credits to other companies. So they are profitable because of regulatory support.
Next question over there, please.
Just reflecting on the Tesla experience, a lot of people prior to Tesla said that type of product was impossible. They couldn't build an electric car for an affordable price that anyone would buy, which is a similar sentiment to what people are saying right now about electricity. You know, you can't really compete with coal, natural gas on a broad scale. You can maybe put a few solar panels on the roof, but you're not going to compete with them, you're not going to replace them with a dominant supplier. So do you see, as what would be the Tesla for electricity? Is there an opportunity to create a product, maybe a premium product, that could get buy-in that could start getting compatible? Do we already see that in something like Solar City, or is there something beyond that?
I think we do see that with Solar City, but the Solar City business model is under threat. The utilities have another word for the success of Solar City. They call it the utility death spiral. And that's where lots of customers put solar panels on their roofs, and that drives up the cost for the people that are left of supporting the distribution system, the network of wires that deliver energy. And that creates a stronger incentive to put solar panels on your roof, etc. Utility death spiral. Now, utilities, they know that the way to win their game is to win at the regulatory level, at the commission, right? They can sell energy, that'll feed them for a day, but if they win before their public service commission or utility commission, they get fed for a year, or really 2 or 3 years. And they are now in the process, in the places where Solar City and companies like it have been very successful, of trying to roll out rules that will make them much less successful by charging solar people who have distributed generation on their house an access fee to the grid, a very high access fee. I think an important question is how to create rights to use the grid for reliability purposes that are fair, right? That charge homeowners a fair price for the fact that they use the grid like a battery once they have solar panels on their roof, and that preserve that kind of business model without driving the utilities into serious economic difficulty.
I might add a comment myself. I was a member of this panel too. I don't know if you're from California directly yourself. The city of Palo Alto, where many of us live, provide an option to its customers. It has a city-owned utility, and we have an option, those of us living in city of Palo Alto, to purchase 100% renewable electricity at a premium. So this is perhaps a partial answer to your question, that people, given the chance to do so, do in fact pay more for renewable energy. My electricity bill is about 10% high. It's a very small amount. One of the consequences and one of the mechanisms that make that possible in general in the state of California is the ISO, the Independent, what's that stand for? System Operator, thank you. Try their website, it's wonderfully entertaining. I just looked it up to answer your question. They're currently generating 4.5 gigawatts of renewable energy in the state of California. Most of it right now, you won't be surprised to learn, is solar. But during the night, it goes up very heavily towards wind. And the state of California frequently reaches 20% of its electricity now from the combination of wind, solar, geothermal, and a few other things. So the mechanism here at least does, I believe, work. Let's have another question. Center, please.
Maybe it's more a remark than a question, because I think it's very interesting that you make the remark that with the amount of gas that's now available, coal prices are going to reduce significantly, and the export of coal is probably going to increase. So the U.S. should ask itself, do we want to be a net exporter of coal? But on the other hand, you see there's a big push towards solar, and I think the panel agrees that that's what the U.S. wants, to have more solar power. And on the other hand, one of the main reasons that solar has reduced in cost, obviously its volume, is also the fact that in China, the environmental law there is not wonderful, let's say. I mean, the amount of chemicals that have been dumped in rivers there to cut costs as well is huge. So shouldn't we ask ourselves how, I mean, obviously solar is renewable, but how sustainable that is, especially at the price point where it's at right now?
I think you raise a good point, and you're basically asking us to make the link that the prices for solar panels we're seeing today are largely a reflection, or in good part, a reflection of massive entry by Chinese solar panel manufacturers. And then there's the question, are they paying the full cost of their production processes? And I think that's part of it. I'm not quite sure what to do about it from a policy perspective, other than to notice that many of these companies are bleeding financially even faster than their counterparts in other parts of the world. I think even aside from what we have been seeing over the last 3 or 4 years, let's say, 3 years roughly, where we've really had a massive entry into this industry, and prices have really fallen much, much faster than the traditional 25-year learning curve has suggested. I think that gives me sort of reason to predict that from here on, the price decreases are going to be less steep. On the other hand, the long-term trend in this industry, and this speaks to the previous question, what is the Tesla modus of the electricity industry? Solar PV has the potential for real breakthroughs, but I don't think we need to count on those. If the trend of the last 25 years, which are small incremental improvements, which just come from high volume, much like in other industrial processes, in particular semiconductors, if that holds up, I think solar will continue to improve and close the gap, even if at some point, the Chinese manufacturers are waking up to the full economic realities that they can't run losses, and they also have an environmental balance to consider in all of this.
So another question or comment, please.
What about with respect to the public perception of land use for the different energy generations? So, are you talking about, you can think about NIMBYism for nuclear, offshore wind, the land use for biofuels. What can be done, and for fracking, obviously, what can be done from, say, a policy or education standpoint for the general public to, I guess, embrace some of these technologies that they're willing to have, in order to create a more sustainable environment?
Adam, that sounds like one for you.
Sure, I could talk about that. The two microphones in stereo. This is a very good question. I wish I had an answer for that sort of problem. As you mentioned, it's a pretty general problem. Just an example, I was, so I don't remember the context. I was in a hearing where people were talking about a proposed development, wind development in Northern California that Shell was trying to finance. Shell's wind subsidiary was trying to finance. And you would think, okay, wind power in Northern California, this is going to go over really well. Of course, people are going to want this. And the sentiment among the public was almost universally negative, where people said, wind power is great. It's great somewhere else, not here, basically. And so it doesn't just apply to things like nuclear power plants or things like this. Like I said, I don't know that I have really a very good answer for that. People tend to expect energy availability. When they flip a switch, they want the power to come on. They want it to be cheap and reliable. But when it comes to actually, facing sort of consequences in their local area, they tend to be more resistant. I don't quite know what to say about that, other than it's just sort of human nature. Maybe policy prescriptions need to be made to ensure that we can build the energy technologies that we need. I don't know. Stefan, do you have anything to say about that? Or?
Really only just a comment that I think you're onto something when you worry about that when we do traditional economic analysis and cost calculations, the full value of the land that's being involved in environmental degradation is probably not always taken fully into consideration. And coal in particular comes to mind as one such alternative, where once again, just like with the carbon problem, you have a divergence between what it costs the individual producer to mine the coal and the social cost that society bears, which arguably is considerably higher. And I think, once again, like with the carbon problem, the only effective way to correct this is through regulation and a system in which government ultimately sets the right incentives for these costs to be internalized.
Could I just pitch a class on that question? David Hayes, who was the Deputy Secretary of the Interior, charged with running the federal process for federal land, citing large renewable projects on federal land, so think big solar in the Mojave, is at the law school this year. He just stepped down and he's going to teach a class on novel legal mechanisms for dealing with the renewable siting problem. So I recommend anyone who's interested in that maybe checking out that class. might be interesting.
I also wanted to plug a class in response to that question. Last spring quarter, we had a class in energy resources engineering called 101A, Energizing California. It was a weekend-long field trip. We went to the ISO, and we went actually to a wind farm and several other places too. But in answer to the point that you raised, what was intriguing to me is how massive the land area of wind generation is in the state of California, and actually embraced by the people, the farmers whose land it was on. They all thought it was wonderful because they had a relatively low income from farming, and they were getting, I don't know, thousands of dollars a month from their wind turbines. And so they were competing with their neighbors to get more wind turbines on their land than the person next door. Let's see if we have some questions on this side. Please.
It seems like, is it fair to say that renewables are largely dependent upon a really good regulation system, a really strong government that's able to monitor and regulate, the financial decisions of the people of the country? Because it feels like that, like you were saying, if we're the Saudi Arabia of coal, that the developing world and other areas are going to continue to import this coal that we produce, while we can still, is there a way, are we going to have to maybe raise the cost of coal artificially as it gets exported out in order to, because we can't, how else are we going to enforce third world countries wanting to burn it? It seems like to make renewables really work, we have to somehow make it economically not viable for developing world to use the basic fossil fuels. Is that rational?
I think that's a very sensible perspective to have. The reasonable first priority of a developing country is development. It's really our first priority. If we're honest about it, right? Environmental policies take a back seat to making sure that the unemployment rate is at a reasonable level. That's development, right? So, and that's even more true when you're lifting people out of subsistence agriculture into lives that are more meaningful, where prospects, especially for their children, are really much better. So you can't ask people to sacrifice that for some long-term objective about climate, because they just won't. Now, that being said, the US has a really important leadership role to play in this broad conversation. First, by supporting technologies and getting them down that learning curve, getting them down that cost curve to the point where they can compete. And then by setting a regulatory example that can be adopted by the rest of the world. And we're doing an okay job on that first part, largely because of, well, I think because of a mix of state and federal support for renewable technologies. Second part, not so much. And the policies that are poised to be rolled out are quite inflexible and lack cost effectiveness, I think is the generous way to put it. But that's all that the Obama administration has been able to accomplish, given the congressional situation. It's the best we can do. All we can do is try to set an example, with the countries that view us as their major economic partner / competitor.
Just very briefly, I fully agree. At the moment, renewables, and in particular solar PV, in the United States relies crucially on public subsidies. Other countries have other subsidy mechanisms. But for the U.S., it is largely two ingredients. It's the so-called federal investment tax credit, and it's a possibility of writing off these types of investments in a faster way, which gives you a break, basically, on your income taxes. These two instruments together are very powerful. So if you do sort of some kind of life cycle cost analysis, you would come to the conclusion that if you pull these two ingredients, these two instruments away at the moment, your cost would increase by about 70%. That would put solar probably out of business at this stage. But then I come back to what I talked about earlier. If the trend that we have seen over the last 25 years holds up, these subsidies are not needed indefinitely. And again, this does not require a breakthrough necessarily. It just requires for the industry to be able to stay the course. And then I think you can now quibble about how many years it would take until those subsidies could be phased out and solar would be able to stand on its own feet.
In regards to subsidies, oil and gas doesn't need subsidies to survive, and yet they still get them. So I guess, could you talk a little bit about how many of those, if they're being planned on being phased out, are they actually going to be put to industries that do need the support?
I guess that is a course by itself, since courses were advertised here earlier.
Corn in with that also needs a subsidy?
Pardon?
Can we throw corn in with the subsidy?
Right. I mean, on corn, this was mentioned earlier. Yes, so there is a whole range of subsidies, and you ultimately want to ask what's the level playing field in all of these things. And they come in a variety of forms. But I would submit, again, sort of to some extent now, taking a little bit the defensive perspective from for fossil fuels. None of these move the envelope quite as much as the ones that we have currently in place for solar. So perhaps full stop there on the corn, and we talked earlier about corn-based ethanol. I think there things are actually moving in the right direction through the renewable fuel standard too, which is sort of just kicking in and giving other types of renewable biofuels a much better push in terms of basically getting a subsidy and getting those off the ground.
I might interject a comment there also too. What the general public calls a subsidy is not always the same as what the economists call a subsidy. So, sometimes the depletion tax allowance, for example, is referred to as a subsidy. Whether or not it is, you can decide. But as I say, the newspapers and the economists don't always refer to the same thing.
Can you talk just a little bit about the water requirement associated with along the same line, the question of land requirement with all these energy?
Yes, I should mention that we had a water dot to connect at the connecting the dots, but unfortunately the speaker was not here. Does anybody want to go with water, David?
Yeah, I think with water, what was surprising to me was how the renewables are really all over the map in terms of water use. And on the one hand, you get something like biofuels, which could be really consumptive of water. On the other hand, you have solar PV, which is very minimal use of water. But if you have solar CSP, which with water cooling, it actually is even worse than some of the traditional fossil fuel technologies. So it's a good example, I think, of when you start thinking about multiple constraints at the same time or multiple goals at the same time, you come up with pretty different answers. And I think for me, the water picture really is another factor pushing solar PV, at least as an objective, as opposed to some of the other, and wind for that matter too, as opposed to some of the things like the shale gas or CSP or things like that. On the, I just wanted to mention on the corn ethanol question, the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standards, was set to transition. I mean, corn was a bridge to cellulosic and other things. But each year, the reality is that the EPA revises that, and all of a sudden, corn or other crops are then allowed to take up a bigger fraction. And you can argue how much of that is well, a lot of it is technology just lagging what was expected. But a lot of it is politics, and the way that the Renewable Fuel Standard was formulated on absolute increases in volumes of ethanol as opposed to, say, a contribution to the fraction of overall fleet demand is interesting, because we're not actually using much more gasoline each year, but the RFS ramps up, and so what happens is now the cars can't take more ethanol than they haven't up to now. They're about at the blend wall, which is 10%, and I'll talk about this Wednesday. Then the question is what happens. Actually, the RFS is telling the blenders they need to use more and more ethanol, but the cars are saying, right now the current fleet is saying, well, we can't use more ethanol. And so do you change the fleet and lock in that technology for longer? And these all come down to questions, I think, of, unfortunately, politics, which, unfortunately, because I don't know much about it, but our next panel will know something about politics.
Okay, we're coming a little close to the end of our allocated time. Let me ask, does anybody have a question or comment to Stacy? She's feeling lonely and left out here. Anybody? Yeah.
I'm interested, especially about the natural gas part. We talked that we've been using natural gas for years for cars, right? And I know that it's proven to I mean, the natural gas is proven to be a good substitute for gasoline, and it's very efficient, and it's low carbon emissions, and also low cost, which is just 1/3 of the gasoline. I know that there has been a serious research about the technologies to convert the plants, right? The plants of trees, vegetables, and grasses, and even trash into green gas. So I wonder if there is a progress, so far. So you guys are the experts in this work in this field, so maybe you can answer this question.
Well, that's not in my area either, but I can go for it. I mean, there is a lot of work going on looking at reducing, for example, carbon dioxide into fuels that could be useful and competitors for things like natural gas. There's also work on sort of biomass for those applications. A lot of that, certainly the work on CO2 reduction involves lots of catalysts, so you'll probably have some people coming to speak with you this week about different types of catalysts to make those conversions. There's quite a big effort here at Stanford now on that. Yeah, those are challenging problems. But hope for the future with some good science and technology to make those happen.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we'll take one more question before we finish. Everybody's pointing at him.
I wanted to say thank you all for speaking with us. I'm into RN in the chemistry program. Professor Bent, I wanted to ask you specifically. It was mentioned earlier that there's an assumption that the learning curve for solar will continue at a relatively constant pace. I wanted to ask you whether you think that's actually a reasonable assumption in terms of price per watt efficiency, given that there is actually a theoretical limit on one hand to solar efficiency, and yet on the other hand it seems that new generations of solar panels can surpass this limit.
I think we still have a long way to go before we hit the sort of price per watt that's limited by efficiency, because prices are still coming down. And as you mentioned, there are technologies that can go above, the sort of single junction type efficiency. So there's still a ways to go. I mean, I think what's interesting about the development of solar cells and solar technology, and I work in this area and some of these next generation ones, is a lot of the work and development is really coming back to silicon. So with the original really good solar cell, which seemed to have plateaued at least in efficiency, there are all kinds of benefits to using silicon, not least of which is it's very abundant, stable, works well, and so there's a lot of really interesting work on making silicon work in new ways. In addition to, of course, all these different types of materials and going to nanoscale materials to get some of these higher efficiencies that you're alluding to. So I think we still have a long way to go in bringing price down. It's not all going to come from improving efficiency, of course, the price per watt. A lot of it's going to come down because of economy of scale and manufacturing, because actually the materials cost is a pretty small fraction of the cost per watt. So there are lots of other ways to bring that price down.
All right, thank you. I think, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So thank you, panel, and thank you for your attention.